We're beginning today something that I have never done in over 40 years of pastoring, and that is a series of studies from the book of Proverbs. I've never done it. I've preached through the minor prophets, but I've never spent more than an isolated sermon here or there in the book of Proverbs. And we know that Solomon is the primary author of the book of Proverbs. There are some Proverbs from others, but he's the primary writer. And to understand why Proverbs is so important, 2 Chronicles chapter 1 sets the stage. This is when Solomon has now become king. He's followed his father, David. And it's time for him to assume his responsibilities and establish a kingdom. And he goes to the altar to pray. It's always encouraging when your political leaders understand the importance of prayer. Solomon goes to the temple to pray. Verse 7. That night God appeared to Solomon and said to him, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." If God showed up at your house today and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you," what would be on your list? That hit me last night. I wonder what I'd ask for. Solomon answered God, "You have shown great kindness to David my father, and have made me king in his place. Now, Lord God, let your promise to my father David be confirmed. For you've made me king over a people who are as numerous as the dust of the earth. Give me wisdom and knowledge, that I may lead this people. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" God said to Solomon, "Since this is your heart's desire, and you've not asked for wealth, possessions, or honor, nor for the death of your enemies, and since you've not asked for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people over whom I made you king, therefore wisdom and knowledge will be given you. And I will also give you wealth, possessions, and honor, such as no king who was ever before you ever had, and none after you will have." Wow. God says, ask whatever you want. Solomon says, I need wisdom and knowledge. God said, I'll give it to you. And we are the recipients of some of that wisdom and knowledge contained in the book of Proverbs. Someone has said that what Psalms is to our prayer life and our devotional life, Proverbs is to our practical life. It's a unique book in all of the Bible because there are sections, like the section we're going to be looking at this morning, there are sections that are thematic, that you can kind of break down. It kind of follows an outline. But then much of the book is a collection of seemingly random and unrelated proverbs. You read one verse and then you read the next one. It seems to have nothing to do with the one before it. And so I suggest that if you want to study the book of Proverbs, and it would be a good idea to do that, that the best way is to study it topically. If you have a study Bible that you don't mind marking in, get some colored pencils, and as you read through the book of Proverbs, like mark, underline, or circle key words like wisdom, understanding, phrases like the fool or the fear of the Lord, and just as you go through the book, you'll see them all consistently through the book, but not all in one place, and then go back and study those themes. It will really open up the book of Proverbs to you. Somebody has said that a proverb is like a small picture. And when you study topically, what you're doing is you're gathering all those small pictures that have the same theme, and you kind of have a grouping of thematically consistent pictures. As you study Proverbs, you'll find that there are three basic types. There are the contrasting ones, where the first part is contrasting with the second part, usually has the word "but" in the middle of it. You know, like a wise son accepts his father's discipline, but a scoffer doesn't listen to rebuke. Then there are comparing parables that compare, and that's kind of like better is this than that. And then there are the complementary parables where the second part kind of completes or complements the first. Commit your way to the Lord, and your way will be established. So you'll notice those three kinds of proverbs as we go through this book. But this morning, we're going to look at the first 6 verses. because the first 6 verses of the book of Proverbs answers this question. Why should we study the book of Proverbs? Now, I want to, before I read it from the NIV, I want to read it in a couple of other translations. What I want you to do is listen as we follow along in the reading and see if you can isolate the reasons Solomon gives why we should study the book of Proverbs. This is the New American Standard. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. Many of us have come to appreciate Eugene Anderson's paraphrase, The Message. He's got such a unique take on things. Here's how he paraphrases this. These are the wise sayings of Solomon, David's son, Israel's king. Written down so we'll know how to live well and right, to understand what life means and where it's going. A manual for living, for learning what's right and just and fair. To teach the inexperienced the ropes and give our young people a grasp on reality. There's something here also for seasoned men and women, still a thing or two for the experienced to learn. Fresh wisdom to probe and penetrate. The New Living Translation. These are the Proverbs of Solomon, David's son, king of Israel. Their purpose is to teach people wisdom and discipline, to help them understand the insights of the wise. Their purpose is to teach people to live disciplined and successful lives, to help them do what is right and just and fair. These proverbs will give insight to the simple, knowledge and discernment to the young. Let the wise listen to these proverbs and become even wiser. Let those with understanding receive guidance by exploring the meaning in these proverbs and parables. You kind of get a feel for why the book was written. And then from the NIV, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. Let the discerning get guidance, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. Why should we study the book of Proverbs? You've already filled in all the blanks just from listening to the scriptures, right? First, to gain wisdom. If that were the only reason it gave us, it would be worth studying the book of Proverbs. Now, what I will be doing this morning and through this series is defining these terms for us, because it's one thing to read the word, it's another thing to understand what it means. And as I define these words, I'm going to define them the way the original Hebrew word was defined. In other words, when you study the Bible, you don't need Webster's dictionary, because the Bible wasn't written in Webster's dictionary English. The Old Testament was written primarily in Hebrew. The New Testament was written primarily in Greek. If you want to know what the meanings meant to the people who read them originally, go to that language and find out what that word meant. And it's with the resources that are out there today, you don't have to know a letter of Hebrew. You don't have to know a letter of Greek. Let me just throw out a couple of things for you here if you want to do this on your own. You can get a Strong's Concordance. The Strong's Concordance has every word of the Bible in it, including the ands and the thes. I mean, he was serious when he said every word. Get a Strong's Concordance. It's now even available for the NIV. Strong's Concordance has numbers. By the words, there's a number. You go to the back of the concordance, and there's a Hebrew dictionary and a Greek dictionary. You go to the number in the back. Fortunately, it's in numeric order, so if you can count, you can find the word, and it'll tell you what that meaning is. there are other resource books out there, many of them online now, that you actually are, you'll see a book and it will say, numbered to Strong's. And what that means is that particular book, you can go to the same number and it will give you an expanded definition of the word and how it was used. So don't say, oh, I didn't have the training y'all did, so I don't know. There are resources out there that you can really, for a minimal investment, really dig into the scriptures. And you'll find that it really is basic and simple and easy to use, and will just richly enrich your study of the scripture. So I'm not going to be quoting what the English word wisdom means. I'm going to show you this particular word that was used, and when Solomon wrote it in Hebrew, this is what that word meant. The word wisdom means the ability to see something from God's viewpoint. That's wisdom. The ability to see something from God's point of view. To see what He requires, and to be able to see the relationship between unnecessary problems that we face and disobedience to God's principles. Part of wisdom is seeing, I was disobedient over here, I'm paying the price over here. It's the ability to see things from God's perspective. Someone said wisdom is a divinely created system of rules that governs the moral fiber of the universe. But wisdom in a core is the ability to see life from God's perspective, from His viewpoint. Then he says, for understanding. Now the word understanding is the ability to respond to life situation from God's viewpoint. It's knowing how to apply your wisdom. It's one thing to see things from God's perspective. It's another thing to be able to live it out. And when Proverbs uses the word understanding, it means the practical application of God's principles. So Solomon says, here's why I'm writing this book. I want you to have wisdom. I want you to see things the way God does. I want you to have the understanding to be able to apply that to your daily life, to be able to respond properly to whatever life throws your way because you have wisdom and understanding. Then in verse 3, he says, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair. Some interesting words in this verse. The word receive originally carried with it the idea of mobility. What it was taking something with you as you went on your way. You know, in those days, they didn't have a highway system. Basically, you went from one place to another, and people did it often enough, and there was a path. And often those paths would go through somebody's vineyard or, you know, somebody's field, and it was common that as you were walking, it was accepted that as you were walking, you know, if you were walking through somebody's vineyard, you could pick up a few grapes from the vine and, you know, eat them as you went on your way. Not like, you know, going through a grocery store and sampling every aisle, but, you know, that kind of concept. And this word comes from that. Just that as you go, you take something with you to mull on, you know, to think about through the day. What he's saying is, Proverbs wants to help you grab truth as you go through your day and be able to hold on to it. To be able to be alert to what's happening in your daily life. Now let me pause there and give you another history lesson. I just went to Victoria's commencement, so I'm kind of in an educational framework. Between the years of 300 and 200 BC, the Hebrew people began to lose their identity, and they began to lose conversational ability in the Hebrew language. Simultaneously, the Greek Empire was beginning to rise, and Greek was becoming the predominant language of the day. And so the Jews were losing the ability to read the Hebrew scriptures, and were learning more in Greek. And so the religious leaders of the Jewish people wanted to do what they could to keep their people in contact with the Hebrew Bible. And so they assigned a group of about 70 Jewish scholars the assignment of translating the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, into the Greek language, because the people were more conversant with Greek than they were with Hebrew. And so there became a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, by these 70 scholars, and they called it, and still call it, the Septuagint, or you'll hear it called the Septuagint. If you read sometimes and you see LXX, that's the Septuagint, because it's a Latin word that means 70, comes from the 70 people. So when you see LXX, if you're doing Bible study, that's talking about the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Jewish Bible. Now the reason I say that is this. Often you hear me do word studies, and I'll say, now, in this context, this word meant this. Well, this is how we know this. So these Jewish scholars who were conversant, fluent, both in Hebrew and in Greek, as they're translating the Hebrew into Greek, they're looking for the equivalent Greek word. And so once we have that Greek word, then we know how it was used in the Greek culture, and it gives us more insight into what the word originally meant. So you have a Hebrew scholar looking at a Hebrew word and saying, what's the best Greek word to explain this? And then that just opens up a whole world of understanding, because the Greek language of the Bible, of the New Testament, was the common, ordinary, street person Greek language. It was not a heavenly language. It was just the common, ordinary language that the Greek people used. And so you will hear me today and other times say in the Greek translation, the word means this. All right, I gave you all that to say this. In the Septuagint, the word that is instruction is a fascinating word that has the idea of welcoming something with open arms. And it actually had, the word instruction, had three meanings to it. In a physical or parental way, it meant discipline or chastisement. In a verbal way, it was warnings and exhortation. And in a moral context, it had with it the idea of training and instruction. So Solomon says, I want to give you these proverbs so that you will take with you instruction in right behavior and knowing what is right and just and fair. The context, obviously, is talking about the moral instruction, the training and instruction. And in the Greek language, the Greek word that they used in the Septuagint here, it was the word that meant to provide instruction as a parent to a child to bring them into maturity. Now that's when you got to start getting excited. We went a long, dry way to get there. But here's what Solomon is saying. The book of Proverbs has been given to give you the wisdom to see things from God's perspective, to give you the understanding to be able to apply it to your life. And as you do that, you will be gaining in maturity. And if there is one thing that our society so desperately needs, besides God, it's some maturity. We live in such an immature age, don't we? So that's why Solomon says, I've given you the book of Proverbs, and he's just started. Verse 4, to give prudence to those who are simple, and knowledge and discretion to the young. In other words, to give you purpose and discretion in your life. He mentions a couple of different kinds of people. The word simple means without moral direction. That is, they've lost their way. You know anybody who's lost their way? Who have no moral direction? Solomon says, I want to give you prudence. And the word prudence there means to be cautious in avoiding evil. So what he's saying is, I want to give you some warning signs so that you'll stay away from evil. I want the simple among you, those who don't have any moral direction, those who don't seem to know their way. I want to give you some road signs so that you can be cautious in avoiding evil. The word youth there, to give knowledge and discretion to the young, is an adult of marriageable years. It was a wide span of years. And the word discretion is the ability to make proper decisions. So Solomon says, if you're young out there, whether it's young in years or young in maturity, the book of Proverbs will give you some prudence and some discretion. It will help you make proper decisions in your life. I don't know if you know this or not, but Donna's original field was education. And when she was doing her student teaching, she was doing it in a Christian high school, and she actually, part of the assignments that she gave her classes were to read and study the book of Proverbs. And it came from this verse. I'm teaching young people. They need to know how to live. Book of Proverbs is given to teach you how to live. I thought that was a pretty good insight. Verse 5. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. The fifth reason he wrote the book of Proverbs is to increase our learning. Very interesting. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. Now, the previous verse, he's talking to young people. This verse, he's talking to the wise. And he's basically saying, it doesn't matter where you are in your life, this book will help you gain wisdom. If you're young and naive, this will give you the roadmap. If you are more experienced and you have some wisdom, this book will add to it. So you're never too young for the book of Proverbs. You're never too old for the book of Proverbs. And he says, let the wise listen. And that's an interesting word that has with it the idea not just of paying attention, but of obedience. He's saying it's not just enough to read the book of Proverbs. You got to obey it. And it's interesting that very word, listen, in the Hebrew language adds with it the idea of listening and obeying. And he says, hear it. And that's kind of interesting. Let them listen. One translation says, let them hear it. We talked when we talked about prayer a few weeks ago about sometimes it helps you to focus your attention if you pray out loud. I think sometimes it helps us to focus our attention when we're reading the scriptures if we read it out loud and listen to what we're reading. Because sometimes, especially if you're reading a familiar passage, your mind just kind of goes everywhere else because you know it. But reading it out loud forces you to focus on what you're hearing. And this word, add to their learning, it's a rich word. It means to understand it, and it includes understanding it well enough to be able to teach it. So he's saying, I don't just want this to be a theory with you. I want you to be able to teach this. I want you to be able to become so involved in this book and the principles of this book that you're able to help other people understand it, that you're able to teach it. And then let the discerning get guidance. One translation uses the phrase wise counsel. In the Hebrew language, this referred to steering a ship and safely navigating, the rocks and the harbors and all, and safely guiding that ship. In the Septuagint, the Greek word means the same thing. It was used of a pilot guiding a ship. Solomon says, I'm writing this book to you so that you will know how to guide the ship of your life, so that you will know how to safely steer a right course in your life. And it was used in the Greek culture to include administrative ability and leadership and managerial skills. What he's saying there is, I want you to know how to live life and live it successfully. Someone has done a study, I will try to find it and get more specific later in this study, of the Fortune 500 companies and some of their basic core business principles. And he says, they're straight from the book of Proverbs. He says they have no idea that it is, but he said it's what Solomon talked about, how to do your business. There's just so much wisdom involved in this book. And Solomon says, I want you to know how to live your life successfully. So obey the truth of this book. So why should we study Proverbs? So we can see life from God's perspective, and we can respond to life appropriately from God's perspective, so that we will mature. If we're young, that will gain discretion and purpose in our lives. If we're older, that we will increase in our knowledge of biblical truth, so that we can steer a right course in our lives and not end up shipwrecked, as so many people have. Well, when I got to the end of this, wow, this is pretty amazing. First paragraph on this is why you ought to study this book. And then I felt some sadness. Because as I told you at the beginning, this will be the first time that I've ever gone, and I don't know how many weeks we'll be in this, studying through the book of Proverbs. And I felt like I owed an apology, to every church I'd ever pastored for the last 40 years, that I had never gone through the book of Proverbs before. Because what a rich resource to teach us how to successfully live our lives. So I'm excited about these next few weeks, and I want your prayers, because I am digging, and the longer I dig, the more complicated it gets. And it's just like, wow, I didn't know it meant this, and wonder what this means, and where are we going from here? And there's all kind of rabbit trails you can go down. And so I'll appreciate your prayers that the Lord will just open this up so that I will be able to concisely and understandably present to you what God's teaching me as I'm going through this book. It's fascinating what this book has to us. So I'm excited about the next few weeks. And I'm excited as I dig into it, because I'm only about a half a week ahead of us. So I'm encouraged as I get into this. Sometimes if I stand up here in another week or two and say, let's all stand and be dismissed, you'll know that I didn't catch up. But it's going to be an exciting time for us, I believe. And I believe it's going to be a time that really will help us in the practical aspects of how to live our lives. Have you learned in life that there's some people that it doesn't matter what you do, you just can't get along with them? Proverbs talks about it. Just so many different things that Proverbs gives us insight on if we'll just listen and pay attention to what it says. So I'm excited. I want you to be excited as God keeps his promise that as we study this book, these things will be true in our lives. Thank you, Father, for your word. Thank you that it is not just something written about heaven, but it's something written about how to live life here on this earth. And it is my prayer as we go into this book that these qualities will happen in our lives, that we will gain wisdom and understanding, that we will gain spiritual maturity, that we will learn how to navigate the course of life. So many of us know so many people whose lives are shipwrecked because of disobedience to the principles of your word. Help us, Father, to learn from you how to live our lives the way you want us to have the blessed life that you intend for each of us to have. And then help us be able to pass that knowledge on. And the nice thing, I guess if that's the word about the book of Proverbs, Lord, is that we can share those principles, and a lot of times people won't even realize it's from the Bible because of the practical nature of which Solomon spoke. So give us wisdom in passing on what we're learning through this, so that others can understand that the Bible was not just given about history and heaven, but the Bible was given to help us change our lives here and now and live successfully. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Thanks for coming out today. You're dismissed.